Hey everyone, welcome to the live Q&A for Intro to Prop Modeling for Games. I just wanted to take the time to welcome you to my class. So I'm just going to make sure that the stream and everything is working here. I think it should be good. So I'm going to start off with the live Q&A for the first week. We're just going to talk about some high-level topics just about the classroom itself. We'll talk about what I generally cover in Q&As, because this is an intro sort of to CGMA in terms of the infrastructure, the ecosystem, how the website works and everything. So I just want to start by explaining to everybody how the website works, how you get to your assignments, how you actually submit homework, that kind of stuff. And then we'll jump in to just talking a bit about the class as a whole and what's coming up in the future for the class, because we have some other tiers available to people as well as the free tier. And then I want to also go over a bunch of questions. So I have questions here in class questions. And so usually in my classrooms, we will use this area for the Q&A. I'll explain a little bit more about that going forward. But we also have our Discord community. So there's the CGMA community server, which we have questions. There's a section for week 1 Q&A questions. So if you have something you want to ask, it's probably best to submit it as part of the Discord, and I can get into that stuff and actually answer those questions. So yeah, that's my plan going forward. So yeah, let's start off. Just bear with me a second. Oh yeah, hide streaming info from, yeah, okay. Cool. All right, so let me just start by going into the classroom itself. So hopefully you guys are used to how the classroom and everything is working so far. If you don't understand how the classroom works, there's this info button. You can click this. It will basically just give you a guide of all the different parts of the classroom and what they do and how they work and all that kind of stuff. So that's something that can be helpful for you to check out and see what's happening. The other thing I also want to mention is that in the classroom itself, you have an activity page, which is basically your calendar. I had a bunch of questions from various students about when assignments are due, when the class runs, those kind of things. So you should see a calendar. This is actually a calendar of all my classes, but you can see here that we have our Q&A here for week number 1. So that's live at the moment. This is the current time and everything. It gives you all the information. And then if we scroll forward in the classroom, you can see the dates. So our first assignment for the second week is due on the 22nd, and that gives you the time. If you've got your settings set up on the website, it should be your local time zone that this is actually giving you as well. And then we have our Q&A for the second week. This will be exactly the same time as this one is taking place now. And then you have feedback and things available as well for the class. So this is kind of how it goes forward. And then you can just sort of scrub through and see all of the different assignment due dates, when the feedback is due, when the Q&A is due and everything. So should hopefully give you all the information that you need. So if you had any questions about any of the timing on the class, this is the best place to basically look. And I can jump back into the class itself here. Okay, so if I go back over into week number 1, so bear with me a second, that just brings the audio in. So yeah, so hopefully that just gives you a bit of information about how the classroom works in terms of like how you actually navigate the classroom. You have your weeks on the left hand side, your assignment and everything, the overview for the week. This will tell you what you need to do as part of the assignment. And then class questions, as I mentioned previously, this area we usually use if I'm running a class with CGMA. I usually will have, say, a classroom of, say, 20 to 25 students. They can post their questions in here for the live Q&A ahead of time, and then I can either prepare things for the live sessions, or I can actually answer those questions live in the session as well. And then we also use Discord as a live interaction as well. So it gives us lots of options when it comes to questions, but this is the main area I will use, and I will check Q&A questions from if I'm teaching a class for real, basically, like a paid class, basically. Okay, cool. So that covers that stuff. In terms of Q&As in general, if I'm teaching a class that is, one of my other classes, like my substance class or something, what I will generally do as far as the classes are concerned is I'll cover a similar agenda for the live Q&As every week. So what I cover is a summary of what has happened in the week. So I'll just recap where everybody is as far as like their learning is concerned, the videos, and where you should be in terms of your assignments and everything. And then I will generally go through common mistakes and issues, and that is when I've done reviews for people. So in a classroom normally, the assignment will be due, say, the day before the Q&A. I will give feedback on the assignments for the individual students, and then we'll talk about challenges that came up in the week. So it could be stuff like, oh, we had a bug with the software, or there was a particular issue with Substance or something. There was a problem with Blender, whatever it was. We'll cover those kind of common mistakes and issues that came across from every particular student. So it could be stuff that everybody runs into or a few students run into. And it can also just be tips as well. So if it's like, oh, you could do this particular technique in Substance that's going to help you improve this particular workflow or whatever. So that's generally what I'll cover. And then I usually try to recap the next week. So going into, say, week number 2, everybody has finished week 1 at this point for the free class. And we're now into week 2. We're actually in the middle of week 2 because of this is like a bonus extra Q&A. Our proper normal Q&A is actually next week, but this is an extra bonus one. So for the free class, we're currently in the middle of week 2. I would usually give tips and advice of ways to actually improve your assignments, make sure you have the best assignment as part of your second week. So I'll cover some of those things, but that's usually what I will do in a normal Q&A if I'm running the class like for real, basically, as not a free class. So talking about that, let's kind of talk about the class and just the way it's structured at the moment. And hopefully you guys have seen this page where you signed up for the class originally. This breaks down the individual weeks of what we're going to cover, sort of week by week. And then it also teases a little bit of a second part to the class, which I'm going to briefly touch on as well. So where we've kind of got to so far is we've done the intro to the gaming industry. This was very much supposed to just be like a really light early week that we jump into just talking about where students exist in terms of their learning and their education, what the gaming industry is about, what type of roles there are, that type of stuff. That was the intention there, just to get you familiar with all the types of opportunities that you could have if you're just starting your journey into the gaming industry, where you might be thinking about your journey, what types of stuff you'd actually be covering, right? So that's the very first week. We did set an assignment and a homework for this week. It was very light. Again, it was just for you to name your 5 favorite games, just to get the conversation starting, and to talk about the things that you like about the games that you play. So it's like the art of the games, visually what you enjoy about the games. If it's, gameplay, whatever it is, it's good to start thinking about that, because ultimately, whatever role you do, if it's an artist, if it's a designer, whatever it is, you're going to be actually working towards an end project, something that's tangible, that everybody's going to play and sort of appreciate, hopefully. So that's like the idea behind going into video games, is that there's all these amazing different roles and everything, but ultimately you're making a product at the end of the day which people are going to play in their homes, right? So that's kind of the idea. And so with this week, like, I just wanted to get you thinking about that and just give you some kind of ideas of what type of games do you like, why do you like them, what is it that appeals to you, take inspiration from that, because whenever you're sort of working on art and sort of working towards something like a portfolio piece, you're usually having inspiration about things that you like. So it could be being inspired by video games or movies or TV shows or, the real world, nature, whatever it is, right? Like in this class, we're inspired both by all of those things, right? By nature and by other games and other inspirations. So it gets you thinking about those kind of things, right? So that's the very first week. I also, in the class, if you haven't seen it, if you go over into the announcement channel, that I made a intro video which just covers some of the basics of the class as well. It gave you a couple of ideas to get started as far as thinking about your project, because in the upcoming weeks we're basically going to be working on a prop together. We're not going to be working on a finished final game ready prop for this class, for the free class at least. We will do as we go further in the class, but for the free class we're just going to be working on a high poly model. So we're just thinking about modeling. If you're just doing the free class only, you don't need to worry about texturing, you don't have to worry about substance, you don't have to worry about any of those things, because we're just going to be focusing purely on modeling for this particular free part of the class. And then later we can start turning that into something that's going to work in a game engine and things, right? But at least for now, that's the process. So we're currently here, right? Week number 2, we're in the reference gathering and the prop block out. And so if you've watched the videos, if you go over to the website, there's a couple of ways for you to watch stuff. So you can actually watch it through the classroom by clicking this button here. It displays the playlists. You can click the video. This one was the intro. Then you've got your Art Bible, reference gathering, and so on. So you'll click on this, you'll watch that video. And then by the end of this, once you get to the end, there's a recap and homework video. So I always make these for my classes for recap and homework. It's usually just all the information that you need to know about what you need to do for a successful assignment and submission. And so then you would submit your homework as part of the homework gallery here. So if we click on this, it will take us to all the students and the submissions. So obviously there's a lot of people in the class. This usually wouldn't be the case in a regular class, but because this is a free class, we have tons of people in here. But you can see here that when we have an assignment, I'll try and find one here with an image or something, right? If you click on, say, the assignment, it will take you through, like, as for the instructor, for me, right? I can click on the assignment. I can see this person's assignment, their ideas and everything, the reference. So actually, Carol's example that I've picked on here is a really great example of what I'd expect from an assignment submission, because we have an image uploaded, we have some work in progress shots, or, you know, this might be the final submission if it's the block out, right? So you can see these images, and then you can add images into your submission, which makes it a lot easier for me to visualize, like, within the gallery. And then also it gives me a backup for giving reviews. So if I was reviewing your work and the files you uploaded didn't work for whatever reason, then I can still take a look at this submission. I can see the ref board, I can see the model. So it's giving me a really good indication of how you're getting on in the class. You can fill out this description, which essentially tells me what the student has been doing during the week. So I get an idea of, oh, you know, in week number 2, I had this problem, or I really enjoyed this part. I'm really happy about how this is going, that kind of stuff, right? So yeah, so that's kind of a good example. And then you can also upload your files to this, and then usually I can download the file. So if it's within 25 meg, you can definitely upload it to the website. If it's more than that, then you can provide a link, so Google Drive or something like that. I can download the files and actually give feedback in the files themselves. And as an instructor, that is good for me because I can generally give better feedback if I can get into the files and see the models and move around them and see what you've done with the modeling and stuff. Screenshots are very helpful, but sometimes actually looking at the files themselves can be a lot easier for me to actually give more accurate feedback, right? So that's some of the stuff I would definitely say is really useful as far as like the assignments and submissions are concerned. Let me see if I can go back here to that side of it. So yeah, so that kind of covers roughly where we are now. And because we're in the middle of week number 2, our assignment isn't due until the end of this week. And then once, or end of next week, I should say, as part of the assignment there. And then as far as like the next Q&A is concerned, we will cover a bit more of the normal agenda. So we'll go through, you know, what you guys got up to in week number 2, and then I'll do some feedback. So I think because there's so many students in the class, like for the free class, I'm going to pick some assignments at random and then give some feedback for those probably live in the Q&A, so you get an understanding of how feedback would actually work in a typical class. Because as I said, the free class is intended for you to understand what the CGMA classroom is and kind of how it works and what the what the deal is as far as like, you know, working in the class, right? So if you're taking a class normally, you would expect to get feedback for every single assignment submission you would take. But in terms of like the free class, obviously we have a lot of people in the class, so I'm going to pick some at random. So it's a little bit different for that. And then as the class moves on, week 3, we're going to take our block out. So you should hopefully have got to a place where you've at least got your reference board and your idea of what you're creating. And then maybe you're kind of halfway through blocking stuff out for the first week, right? And then as we move on in the class, the second 2 weeks are going to be about how we actually detail that and take it to a more final model. So we'll do high poly detail. So in this case, we tweak our block out to make sense for what we're trying to create. and then we'll do high poly techniques. So I like to break these down. I call them techniques, but you could think of them as other things as well. So maybe another example might be, ingredients in a recipe, right? Or it could be tools in a toolbox. Those are some of the metaphors I like to use to describe this stuff. But essentially, if you have a bunch of ingredients and you know the techniques, then you know how to make a recipe. So it could be like, certain ingredients that go into a spaghetti bolognese, right? You know how to make a spaghetti bolognese, but you can use those same techniques to then make another dish, right? So it's the same kind of principle. We build out these different recipes or ingredients, whatever they are, for making a model, and then you can use those to create the rest of the beetle or rest of the mech that you're creating, whatever the robot is that you're doing, right? So those techniques, because this is a very detailed model and it shows a lot of different things, it's not really possible. It's many hours of work that went into this, right? So it's not really possible to just easily show that in one video. So one of the ways I like to do that is to give these different techniques, and then you can use those. They're applicable to anything, right? It doesn't matter what modeling software you use. It doesn't matter what model you're making. You can use those techniques going forward to create whatever model you're trying to create, right? So that's the idea. And then I do actually show some of it live. I show how to create, a portion of the leg, or, the high poly of the leg. And we're going to go through that basically step by step. How I actually design stuff, how I detail it up, that kind of stuff. And then we do the same thing, but for the head. So we have a bigger portion here. And this has a couple of different techniques that I use because it's a bit more organic. So we use different workflows and things there on that one. So yeah, that's kind of the free class. So this will run now, as I said, next week will be the Q&A and also when the assignment's due, and then it will be sort of week by week. So we'll then follow the same process. And that generally reflects how a normal CGMA class works, is it's sort of week by week. You'll have your first week, your sort of introduction week, generally where we kind of get into just introductions to everybody and sort of understanding who's in the class, and then we'll get into the actual content side of things, and then that is week by week. You submit your assignment, I provide feedback, then you have a Q&A, and that's kind of the end of the week, and then it starts over again kind of every week. So that's sort of the structure, or the how it actually goes in terms of the flow of the class, right? So that's the free class. For this guy, just want to talk about this as well briefly, is that CGMA is going to be offering a class that we can basically extend or continue your education, extend your learning. This is the paid part of the class. So we're going to offer this in two forms. The first form is basically you just get access to all the videos. You can watch everything through. And I believe that's going to be, talking with CGMA this morning, that's going to be $299. That's US dollars for this class, which will be the rest of week 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Which will just be the rest of the class. And you can see what we cover, but I'll briefly sum it up in a second. And then we're going to offer another version, which includes more of the Q&As and the actual feedback, like the one-on-one feedback stuff. So you'll get feedback at every single week. That one is not being announced yet. It's going to be announced a bit later. So keep your eyes peeled for both of those. We're going to announce that stuff soon, and you'll be able to see how that all kind of goes as far as the class is concerned to finish everything off. But just to break it down, essentially what I do here is I cover a lot more of the process of how you actually end up making models in a game, right? Because at some point we take an idea and we execute the idea to make a model, but that has to essentially find its way into a game engine at some point so that when you play the game, it's going to be the model that you see and interact with, right? And so the first thing that we do in the class is we convert our high poly detailed mesh that we did, which is just where we have all of everything is modeled, all nice and detailed. We're going to take that and turn that into a game ready mesh. So in this case, I'm using Unreal 5. So this is actually a nanite mesh. It's going to be more detailed than, a traditional high to low poly baking process, which is something we would have used before Unreal 5. So in Unreal 4, we would have used high to low baking. So we actually, say we had a screw bolt or something in here, we might not model that. We would potentially bake it onto the low poly texture that's in game. We use textures to actually display that information, right? So With Unreal 5, things have changed a little bit, and we are now modeling a lot more of the details, so we can use higher density geometry in our models. So that's something that's relatively new because since the introduction of Unreal 5 with Nanite and everything there. So yeah, that's what we're doing here, and I teach like all the techniques of getting your mesh ready to be in game. So we're doing optimization to the geometry, we're unwrapping the geometry, we're packing and baking everything, setting up all the bakes, and at the end of this week we should have a model that's basically ready to texture, right? Then from there we're going to texture it. So in Substance Painter we're going to build out different materials, smart materials, we're going to do hand painting, and so that's when we go from a gray mesh like you can see in these examples here to actually having textures and materials that we can add scratches, we can add dirt and grime, we can add details and everything in there. And then we cover the process of actually how models can then have applications such as rigging and animation, which means we can move our models. So as an environment artist, like my specialism is environment art, I don't tend to do a lot of rigging and animation as an environment artist. Generally, I do the process from modeling the models and then bringing them into game and texturing them. And that's optimizing them and putting them in a game engine is most of what I tend to do. But then different teams and different departments will often then apply a skeleton to it. So rigging is basically adding a skeleton to it, which then means we can move the objects. And then animating or animation is where we get the object to actually move around. So we can do that in different ways. In the case of this class, I show the basics of how to set up the rig. And then I'm going to do the animation side of it is just keyframe animation. So I basically hand animate this beetle to fly around and do different things and create some nice animation for it. And then finally, the last week, which I tend to have in a lot of my classes, is I'll usually do a presentation week, which is essentially where we have this nice model. How are we going to show this off in a nice way for portfolio? How are we going to put it together with lighting, rendering? How are we going to do the screenshots? How do we upload those to ArtStation? All that kind of stuff, right? So getting it together for a portfolio is essentially the last week. So yeah, that kind of covers the class in terms of what we do in the free class, then how it kind of continues if you take the paid class and some of the extra stuff that you get with the homeworks and stuff. But in the free class, we're going to hopefully show so all of the information that would allow you to make a choice of whether or not you want to continue your education, because this is effectively the same as taking a paid class, just with like, you know, we don't necessarily have everybody getting individual feedback, but it's you know, the structure is there so you can understand what the class actually is and how we actually lay out our CGMA classes. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Okay. Cool. So I think that covers everything I wanted to cover as far as the classroom and everything is concerned. As far as like how you interact with the classroom, the assignments, all of that kind of side of it. We obviously touched a little bit on what a usual Q&A looks like as far as the types of topics I cover. I also have covered the free class and the paid class, and yeah, going forward how that's all going to work, which is cool. And so what I wanted to do is just jump into questions. I have a bunch of questions on the Discord that I'm going to go through. So I'm going to see if I can just like pull this over, just sort of like collapse a few of these categories so it's just easier for me to see what's going on. Okay, so yeah, so for the Discord, like we have a few questions here. I'm just going to go through. So this is all the stuff that's in the week 1 Q&A questions. So if you want to have these questions, if you want to ask more questions, you can submit something in here or create a post for your question for the Q&A. So this first one here from David, he said, when modeling a character in 3D for video games, all its geometry must be quads and everything be unified in the same mesh. Or can it be made as separate pieces and irregularities in the mesh without everything being quads? Thank you very much, and thank you for your work. So this is often a bit of a confusion with games and general modeling stuff, is that everything has to be quadded. It's not necessarily true. The reason what we use quads a lot of the time is because they're easier to work with. Most meshes, when they get exported to a game engine, are actually converted into triangles because that's just how game engines work. And so they all end up in that way eventually when it gets into an engine, but it's much easier to work with quads, which is why that's the advice that is often given. It's absolutely fine to break things into separate pieces. You don't always have to have everything as quads. In general, like, it's better to work with quads for deformation for sure. So if you're planning on animating an object and you want it to kind of bend and manipulate, it's way easier with quads. Generally, the advice I would give you though is that it's all about shading, right? So if stuff smooths and shades nicely, and then you export it to game and it still shades and smooths nicely, you're fine. Most of the time, I will work maybe not always in 100% quads, and I'll triangulate my meshes as they get exported to game, for example. So that's something that is a good way to work. And then if I am trying to do deformation, like if I was making a character, I would be definitely wanting to stick way more to quads, because they're just going to deform a lot easier than if I try to use loads of other, say, engons or other things, right? So something to just give a little bit of consideration to there. I'll just answer John's one here. So John said, hello, I'm Jade, an illustrator from the Philippines. I just wanted to know how a person with skills primarily in 2D and illustration but trained in 3D would be able to fit into the industry. Is there a position that would marry both, or do I focus on 2D or 3D to get a position? I mean, that's a good question. My experience is mostly in AAA games, and they tend to have positions that are more specialized into one area or the other. So it would be 3D or 2D. But generally, I would say you're more likely to see that type of thing where you might get to do a little bit of 2D and 3D in a smaller production. So if you're working in a smaller studio with less people, where they need just like a artist to help out and the team is a lot smaller, that may be a possibility. So that's where I would aim for if you want to do that. But if you have a preference over one or the other, there's no reason that you can't use your skills as a 2D person, right? If you wanted to, say, go into 3D, I personally am traditionally 2D trained. I had a bunch of education in sort of fine art and things like that, so I did a lot of that kind of stuff. But all of that knowledge, it feeds into 3D as well. So you will often have the opportunity to use your 2D skills in a lot of ways when you go into 3D. I guess it would be the same for 2D as well, because if you were a concept artist and you know how to model, I see a lot of concept artists that actually use their modeling skills to help kind of block out their concept images and things like that. So that's definitely something that can help you as well, both ways around. So hopefully that answers that question. So this one was a question about the style of work and collaboration. So the question here is, hi Ben, I hope you're doing great. I have a question about portfolio styles. There seems to be a different opinion on whether it's best to stick to one specific art style in your portfolio, ideally matching the style of the studio you want to work for. However, I think many new artists like myself find this concerning. As I try to enter the industry, I want to explore as many opportunities as possible. It's unlikely that my preferred studio will have opening for junior artists. So I wonder, is it better to showcase a variety of art styles, realistic, stylized, cartoony, etc., to demonstrate flexibility and experimentation, or should I maintain a more consistent style throughout my portfolio? Another question I have is, do you have any tips for collaborating with other aspiring artists on projects? I tried joining a few projects before, but we've often struggled to see them through due to everyone's personal commitments and work situations. It's particularly challenging when there's no immediate reward or result. Have you ever completed non-profit projects in the past? And if so, what do you think was the key success in those situations? Thank you very much. Okay, so the stylized versus realistic portfolio thing is a question I get. I mean, I've lost count, basically, of the amount of times I've had that question. My advice for that is that portfolio-wise, you're always judged like on your weakest piece of work. So just think about that when you're making your work. You want it. Your portfolio is really a showcase of the best of your abilities, right? So that's something I always try to consider with my work. When I was learning and when I was getting into education and then into the industry, one of the things that I personally did was I focused on the thing that I really liked, which was actually sci-fi, right? I worked on a lot of sci-fi, kind of semi-realistic, not completely realism-based because it's Imagineered, right? So I focused on that, and then that's actually what got me a job. And weirdly, I ended up getting a job working on racing games, which is not what you would expect to sci-fi, because I wanted to work on Halo, and that was like my kind of dream project. That's actually, I did end up actually working on Halo in the end, but at least initially I was working on a racing game. I worked on Need for Speed. That was the first project I worked on. So I think it's about, the reason I would have got the job though is because it was about quality, right? So the quality of my work was high enough that it demonstrated the skills to do the job. And that's all that a portfolio is doing, is it's telling the person who's going to employ you whether you have the skills or not to do the role that they're asking for. So if you're an environment artist, you need to showcase that you know how to make environments, you know how to do props, you know how to do materials, and you know how to put a scene together with good composition and lighting and all that kind of side of things. And if you do that in a sci-fi project and the quality is high enough, the likelihood is you will get hired. So that's the way I would look at it. I think that I personally just pick things I like to do because if I'm going to get a job, I want it to be doing something that I really enjoy to do, right? I want to work on a project I really enjoy. And so if I bring that passion and interest across in my portfolio because I'm working on things that interest me, that I personally like, then I think that I'm probably likely to get hired for that type of project. There are definitely, arguments for, if you want to work for X studio, try to create work that sort of mimics the style of the type of stuff they would want you to work on. That can definitely help you as far as like, you want to work on, I don't know, Call of Duty, so you make stuff that could fit within that environment, right? I guess that's something that can be definitely helpful. So yeah, that would be my advice. Hopefully that answers that part of the question. I personally would stick to realistic. I wouldn't, at least initially. I think you can do that later on in your career if you decide, I've done a bunch of realism, I want to go down the stylized route. I think that's good. But it can just muddy the waters, I think. And this is my personal opinion, but I'm sure there are people out there that have a mixture of both. But I personally think, especially if you're aiming for treble A, the likelihood is that it's going to be, a lot of projects are going to be realistic and you're going to have some stylized. So pick which one interests you the most and then aim for that place that you want to work. That would be the advice I would give. That was the advice I had and it worked out for me. So that is what I would say. And then in terms of the collaboration stuff, I think this problem of people working together with different commitments is a issue I see all the time. It's like not something that's very easy to do. And I would say there's a bunch of communities, like you've got your other art communities online, like your experience points. You can see some here, like experience points, Dynasty, those kind of things. And I think that those can be good places to find like-minded people that could help you with those types of personal commitment type of projects, right? That's something that could be pretty good. My advice, like I worked on one collaboration project here. I can show you guys that actually by just screen sharing this. So I worked on this project, which is this collaboration project, and this was made with my friend. And the reason that this was successful was because we both had, he actually approached me about doing this project together. And it was with his intention to basically do more personal projects because he hadn't really done much personal projects in the past. He wanted to do some more on that kind of stuff. So that was why that ended up working well. We set out our schedule really early on and what our commitments were, and we stuck to those. And because he's a really good friend, it helped us kind of like go through that together. If he had issues with his own personal commitments, we could talk about them because we were really good friends. We're close. We could talk about any issues that we were running into, right? So that definitely helps. If you know the person and you have like a good interaction with them, I would definitely suggest that as a really helpful thing as well. Okay, and then here, this is just a question about the course and when things are due and all that type of stuff. As I mentioned, the assignment is due at the end of this week on the 22nd, I think it is. And then we have our Q&A and everything. So you still have, we're kind of the middle of the class at the moment. We're halfway through the second week, if you like. So you still have another week to finish off your block out. Okay. And then here is at what point do you differentiate the beetle to be a character from being a prop? And then we have this reply which said, my take on this is if it's animated like for narrative, NPC, living or sci-fi, AI, robot, its character. Example I can think of, if BD-8 from Star Wars, it's a cool character, but if it's placed in a museum kind of environment and not animated, it goes into a prop category. Not necessarily true. So this stuff, it is, as you've kind of like pointed out here, the waters are definitely very muddy. It can be hard to differentiate between the two of these. And so in the case of what I've done, it's animated, it's rigged. It's kind of a character. We're treating it as a prop because I'm making it for as a prop, right? So I'm going past the point of what a usual prop would generally be. But then what I would say is I have worked on teams where part of the job as a prop artist is to make stuff that ultimately gets animated. So if you think of something like a weapon, like a gun in a game, like I used the Call of Duty example again, that's a prop and it could be made by a prop team, but ultimately it gets rigged and it gets animated, right? So you tend to find, depending on the type of, it depends very much on the studio that you're working as part of, right? And it can depend very much on the type of teams that you have set up and what the needs of the project are and what the scope of the project is and all those kind of elements. But generally it can be that you have a prop team that is also responsible for props that do end up getting animated, right? That's something that I definitely have seen across my career. But then generally characters tend to be like bipeds, like more like humans. You can often have like alien creatures and things like that as well, depending on the game. But they tend to be, as you mentioned, like they could be the main player character, they could be NPCs that you interact with that have dialogue, or they could be, actual characters that you sort of talk to in the game, whatever, right? So that's how they tend to be differentiated. If we were looking at the Beetle as an example, this is quite a good description. Like if it was in a museum, then it definitely probably would be made by a prop team or made by the environment team or whatever. Whereas like, if it was you were fighting the Beetle in like a hack and slash game, then it's likely to be a character and made by the character team. That's how I would probably describe it. But it isn't always the case that every single character in the game is always made by the character team. Like sometimes, it depends on the scope and depends on the schedule. So sometimes, the environment or prop team can lend a hand in those places. So something to just consider anyway. All right. I'm just going to jump back to, we had a question here, which was the 5 pages versus 5 photos. I don't know whether to show about 5 photos of a project in ArtStation or create a detailed document where I explain how I did each process for my final result. I mean, show my pipeline in about 5 pages like a magazine style. Please, what do you recommend? So I guess it depends on the intention of what you're trying to show, right? If you're wanting to do like a breakdown of something, then I think that magazine style kind of thing works. If you're trying to show a final project, like a final finished portfolio piece, then I would just do it as images. That would be the advice I'd give you there. Okay. And then we have future of hard surface props, artists with AI and outsource. Given the situation in the industry, AI making 3D models and international outsourced studios, how do you see the landscape changing in the next 5 years, and what do you recommend to those focusing only on hard surface? It's a difficult question. I think with the AI stuff, nobody really knows at the moment. It's like, looking into the future with these types of technologies at the moment, I personally haven't seen a whole lot of 3D modeling with AI stuff actually making its way into my part of actual everyday job, if that makes sense. Like I haven't seen it really influencing much in the industry, at least. But I do see that technology is obviously evolving a lot, and you can see that it's there for the sort of 2D side of things as well. So I guess it's just like, it's difficult to really recommend anything because you don't know what you don't know. It's difficult to say really, but at the moment, I think like one of the things that we're seeing with AI in general is that it's using things that exist in the same way. If you look at something like, Megascans as an example, right? Like we scan the real world. So there's certain limitations with Megascans. You can't make a sci-fi spaceship, right? Because sci-fi spaceships, as much as we know, we can't scan them, right? They don't exist, so we can't scan them. So it's difficult for us to be able to actually, say, well, we want to get like data from a sci-fi ship. We have to actually make that and texture it and model it, right? And it's the same thing for AI. It's obviously using data that already exists. I know we're feeding it things from concept artists and things like that, but a lot of the time when I've played around with the AI side of things, I've found that it has been difficult to generate the exact thing that I want, and so it requires some tweaking and adjustment. And 3D models are ultimately very complicated and often a lot more complicated than 2D images, right? So something to think about is like, how is it going to optimize geometry? How is it going to optimize textures? all these kind of things. There's a lot of like training and thought that goes into being a 3D modeler. So at the moment, at least, I'm not super worried about it. I'm sure, there might be some technology that comes out about that, but I think it also does take a little bit of time for that to trickle down into the industry anyway. So at the moment, I don't have a whole lot of advice, but just my advice really is just to keep your eye on these kind of things and learn them and experience them yourself and make decisions about them. That's like basically what I do. Just keep up to date with the technologies. It's generally good advice for the industry as a whole because technology is always evolving. So you need to make sure that you're kind of ahead of that as much as possible. So that's something I definitely would give you some advice about for sure. Let me take a look at this one. Does 3D modeling help my game design skill? Hello, I'm Andre from Jamaica. I'm a student doing an animation course there. I was wondering if 3D modeling helps my game design skills in the video games industry. Also, does a game designer need an animation degree to create games? No, I don't think so. I wouldn't be able to give you advice about exactly how you would apply to be a game designer because I'm not a game designer. I'm an environment artist, so I haven't gone through that process. So I wouldn't want to give misinformation in that area as far as like how to get into game design. I know from just like talking to friends how they have their journey into game design and things like that. But, I wouldn't want to give loads of advice in that area. But what I would say is that 3D modeling is definitely going to help you understand form and composition, which are all skills that you would definitely need as a designer. So I don't think it's going to hurt you to know 3D modeling as a game designer. And as a designer, one of the things that you have to do is block out game spaces like levels and things like that. So working in 3D and all those kind of things, it's all skills that are kind of transferable within different disciplines. And I definitely have seen people jump between those disciplines, so go from 3D modeler to game designer and back, and so on and so forth. So that type of stuff is definitely great. I think animation and game design are quite different disciplines, so I definitely wouldn't say you need an animation degree to be able to be a game designer, for example. Having a degree in something game related, though, is definitely useful when it comes to being able to progress through that stuff. So that's pretty good. Advice while trying to get into the industry. Any advice on what to do while trying to get into the industry? For me, I have been applying for the past year and not getting anywhere. Maybe it's to do with my portfolio not being ready, but I need to start getting some income while waiting to get into the industry. That's a good piece of advice. I don't know what a good question, I should say. I don't know what your background is as far as education is concerned. Obviously, you haven't given a huge amount of depth as far as like, what is your education and learning. And you just mentioned that you have a portfolio and you're not sure if it's ready. I think, if you haven't done already, I would get yourself onto different communities. Like you've got your Discord communities, like I mentioned, you've got your CGMA communities. Work out if you need to go into education, either through higher education or through online courses and things like that. That would be something that could definitely be useful to figure out. And then start to ask questions, like start to post your portfolio in places and ask for feedback and advice in those communities and see where you're lacking, right? So there's a lot of people there and industry professionals will help you as far as like being able to give you advice on your portfolio and give you things where you might be going wrong. So that's basically the advice I would give you. And then if you're applying and you're not being successful, you can also ask for advice from the places that you apply for as well. So yeah, that would be the thing I would definitely say. Cool. And then how would you try to get your first job in the concept art or the games industry in general? So I will just describe what my journey looked like for getting into the industry, and then there are other methods, but this will hopefully help explain it for everybody here. So yeah, my process was firstly, I took various art kind of specialisms and things like that when I was in education. So in the UK, you basically go to school, then you go to college, and then university. That's kind of the journey that you would take if you went through various different stages of education. And so in school, I wanted to look more into art because that's what I was interested in and what I was good at. So I would do art and design. So that would be sort of more fine art and drawing and painting and all that kind of stuff. And then when I went to college, I specialized more in those areas. So I was I think you choose like 3 or 4 subjects that you want to specialize in. So I did maths and physics and art and design. Basically, those were the things that I ended up looking more into. And so then you build up sort of more skills in there. I did a lot of digital painting and a lot of traditional fine art as well, painting, drawing, illustration, and then actually making things as well. So I was like modeling cabinets out of wood and that kind of stuff, right, with design and art. And then when I went to university, I did a foundation course, which was only a year-long degree class, and that basically taught you a lot of the basics of things like fine art, illustration, photography. I did some working with glass, jewelry making, all these different types of things. So you get to experience all of these different areas, and then you can pick one that you want to sort of take forward. So I looked more into graphics and illustration. And then from there, I went to look at a game degree course, which is what I ultimately ended up doing, which was a 3-year course. And that was actually split into 2D and 3D. So you did 3D modeling and also concept art. And originally, I thought I wanted to do concept art as a job role. So if I wanted to be a concept artist, I basically would just have started painting, digital painting and concept art as much as I could, and practicing, getting my Photoshop skills and knowledge really up there. And then I would also, one of the things with concept art is I think people can get confused that it's mostly just about painting really nice images, but concept art is a tool that is used in the games industry for 3D artists to figure out how to design stuff. So your job is much more a visual designer than it is like painting nice pictures. So that's the part that, from a portfolio perspective, if you're trying to build a portfolio out, that's the thing that you should focus on, is trying to make sure that you get actually working ideas. So if you're trying to design a character, it's like making thumbnails of your character, exploring ideas in a loose way, and then from there kind of going into like actually finalizing a design and everything. So that's basically the advice I would give you in terms of like how to get into concept art. And it's just lots and lots of painting, lots and lots of practice. And then just, have a look at example portfolios and the types of things that people are showing, and then, go from there, basically. Okay, cool. And then I'll just go through. So this one's just a follow-up from that, which was, I should have mentioned I have a certificate in animation from college in Ireland, and I have a sculpting certificate in ZBrush from another college. I am primarily a hard surface artist, but going more to environment. Mostly self-taught, and have done a number of online courses. And this is your portfolio. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I guess like my advice would be to get more into those communities, right? Because there's a lot of people that can help you in terms of asking advice for your portfolio. Because I would usually like look at the portfolio and give you advice, but because there's lots of questions, I need to get through those. But that's the type of stuff that I generally tend to do more on some of my classes, right? If I've got a smaller class of like 20 to 25 people, it's something that I often will approach in the in my classes, right? If someone takes one of my classes and they ask these types of things, like I will usually do like a portfolio review in the live Q&A or something like that. So that's something we can also generally do as part of CGMA. But yeah, there's plenty of free communities as well that you can look at for that type of stuff too. Okay, so and then here we have, with all the recent mass layoffs since the start of the year, what are your expectations for the rest of the year? How would someone make the best use of this period as someone who recently just got laid off? I mean, it's a tough time in the games industry at the moment. There's a lot of layoffs happening. For people who don't know, last year there was a lot of layoffs and everything. There really isn't a lot I can say about that other than it sucks if you get laid off. I've been laid off in the past. It's not a nice experience. The best advice is just to keep your head up, work on your portfolio, make sure that you're as hireable as possible. If you've already got a role in the industry, that's obviously a good thing because, you know, your foot's already in the door and everything. I guess my expectations for the rest of the year, it's like, I don't really like to speculate or sort of like try and figure out what the future holds. It's a little bit like what's going to happen in the next 5 years with AI. It's like, I don't know. It's just, I'll just be guessing, and I don't know how helpful that is to people, right? Like I can guess and say, oh, you know, it's going to be terrible or it's going to be really good. And I could be wrong in both cases. So I don't think that that's super helpful. I think what is helpful is focusing on where you are now and what you can do to improve your chances of finding another job if that's the case, right? So I would definitely focus on your portfolio and definitely your connections, right? That's one of the things that gets me my roles, is that most of the jobs I've had now, I think maybe except the first one I had, every single other one was based off of like someone I knew or a recommendation. So those connections that you make and people that you work with are the things that can really help you out in those situations, right? About firstly, even knowing the jobs exist and then actually getting the opportunity to apply and interview and all those kind of things. That's something that can really help, right? Okay, let me just go down for a few more of these as well. So we talked about these guys. I'm just going to try and get through some of these ones. Cool. Are there any other methods besides character sculpting? I don't like sculpting in character creation, but I can sculpt for details and props. Is there any way I can do this with a character? And then you've got box modeling as one of the ways to do things, but it can be slower than sculpting. So yeah, I mean, it depends on the type of character that you're trying to create. Generally, if you're doing something organic, there's not really much way around sculpting. You kind of need to be, it's one of the skills you'll need as a character person. If you don't like sculpting, maybe making characters isn't the type of role for you. Potentially, if you're more someone who likes hard surface, for example, and you don't like doing lots of organic, then you're going to lean more towards that as a skill set, right? So that would probably be what I would say in answer to that particular question. For networking, what do you think is the best way to network in the industry? How do you connect with people and stay connected without being overbearing or stalker-like? What kind of questions would be a good starting point to popping up or finding someone to pop up to? Thanks. And then David has said, regarding network, do you think it's a good idea to connect with people throughout the internet to find a first job in the industry? And if so, through what platforms or way could it be done effectively? Thank you very much, and thank you for your work. Cool. So I think this is a great question. So as far as networking is concerned, it's definitely challenging because especially as our industry is becoming more online with like remote working and all that kind of stuff, it's a lot more difficult to meet people in person. The advice I would have usually given is like attend events, right? Like gaming events, and meet people and talk to people and ask advice, because, you know, I've been to various different kind of gaming events and things in different places. Like they have various, I'm trying to think of the name of the one that they have in London. They used to have one. I don't know if it's still going on, but I've forgotten the name of it. There's like an event that you can go. It's a little bit like your E3 or your GDC or something like that. It's like a gaming event where people show off like the latest games, and then you can talk to the developers. Like they'll have their teams and studios there. They also have like industry days as well at some of those. I've forgotten the name of it, but that type of stuff is really good for networking because you can actually meet people that are working on the games, talk to them, ask them questions. If you go on one of the industry specific days, then you'll be able to find that kind of stuff. I also built up those kind of connections initially by when I went into higher education. We used to have people from the industry come to visit, so I would make an effort to go and interact and talk with them when they gave their presentation or talk. And that's something that you can do. I would also say, as far as like advice for reaching out to people is concerned, just remember that, you know, everybody is a human being, right? So if you just sort of launch yourself into like, oh, how can you help me and things with all this stuff, then it's like you're less likely to get a response. I would say that, you know, if I received like a message, and this is just like on a personal level, if a student sends me a message being like, you know, oh, I found your work through this way, I really like your portfolio, this is something that I really like about your work, I've got a question about this, like I'm hoping to get into the industry one day, I was wondering if you could like answer my questions or maybe look at my portfolio and give me some advice. Just treat people like they're actual people, and I think you're more likely to get a response from everyone, because, you know, obviously as I try to help as many people as I can, it is difficult sometimes because I get lots of messages, so it's not always possible to reply to absolutely everybody all the time. It's like something that's difficult, but in general, if someone spends a lot of effort to try to reach out to me and does it in the right way, I'm way more likely to respond. Whereas if they just like try to launch into like all of this stuff, like, can you help me fill in this survey, blah, 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 the likelihood is I'm not going to be wanting to do that as much, right? If you take the time to approach somebody, because, you know, ultimately I was in the same position as everybody at one point, like I was learning just like everybody else was before I made it into the industry. So, you know, I understand the journey, understand the struggles and all that kind of stuff. So I can relate to that for sure. But it's like, I think if you just try to treat people as nicely as you can, that's something that can definitely help you. So that would be the advice I would give you there as well. For Booleans, I was playing around with some Boolean operations, and always after applying the Boolean, you have to change the edges to have cleaner connections in case you want to bevel, etc. But then the question strikes why the mesh needs that connection, like you cannot delete all connection edges or you will lose part of the face. But I was wondering the logic behind it, since the shape is imprinted in the mesh, why I need to have edges across a flat plane. So most of the time you can work with, if you're working with Booleans, you can work with n-gons. I tend to just add triangulation at the end of that. Sometimes you do get the thing you're describing where you delete a face or an edge or something, and it will remove the connection, will remove the face or something like that. It's usually because you're using the wrong type of deletion. In most cases, you can delete just the edge without deleting the faces and things like that most of the time, and you can work pretty much with Booleans without any real issues, right? Without it being like much of a problem in general, if you know how to work with that type of stuff. Most of the time, though, if you try to export it and you were to put it into a game engine, then you're going to have problems because it's expecting a quadded or triangulated mesh. So if you put stuff with loads of n-gons in, it may give you some weird issues with like the way the faces are actually working there. So it's always a good idea, basically, before you export, to just put a modifier with a triangulation on the model to export it. That would be the advice I'd give you there. For the notification of pre-homework assignment, so I'm just reading this. Today, confused at this point, I checked all weekend to see if there's anything new. Now this morning, I look at my phone and see the pre-homework assignment. Oh yeah, so this was just about filling in the questions and everything. I think most people, this has been mostly handled by CGMA, this one, which is cool. Successful applications. So in the vein of portfolios, applications and networking, in your experience, what have you found to be a standout things in good portfolios and successful job applications in your industry environments? And can you think of examples related to people who have newly joined your team in the industry, perhaps something to shed some light on the process of joining a studio and team for those who are a little in the dark and unsure of where to focus on skills? Yeah, so I have this question very often, right? About what's the best way to build your portfolios? Like, how do you figure out what you need in your portfolio? All those kind of questions that relate to this general topic, right? And then also what stands out, those kind of things. So the advice I would give you, and I'll show you how I would usually do this. So this is something I cover a lot in my classes because it's something that people really want to know, like how do you improve your portfolios and things like that. So advice I would give to begin with is, if you're looking for a job, you've got job applications, right? So if we go over I'm using ArtStation here just to demonstrate this, but you can do this on other websites as well. Like if you were on LinkedIn or something, you can find a job and we can look, do a search for, junior, or we could just do let's do environment artist, and we can do a search for environment artist, right? And so the thing to know about an environment artist's position and its job description is it tells you a huge amount of information that's very helpful for you to know when it comes to applying for a job. And they generally are broken down in the same way in most job specs, right? You'll see this is kind of like detail about the job, what skills you're going to need, right? Like it's usually broken down into these different ways. So if we look at, another example, you'll see that actually that one's not got a lot of detail. Let me try and find one that's got a bit more detail. So we've got Epic's environment artist, for example. Everything you're going to do in the role, what skills do you need, right? It's always the same thing. Here's some information about the company as well if you want to know about the company. So it's always the same kind of thing. And so I think it is something that people don't necessarily realize is that this actually gives you all the information that you need to know about what you should be doing when you're applying, as far as your portfolio and everything else that's concerned, as far as what do you need to do to get a job at this place, right? So as an example, we'll look at this one from Epic. This explains some of the types of things you would be doing in the job. So you can kind of gauge based on the job description, the types of information that you actually need to know. So in this case, we've got good color theory, technical expertise in architecture, lighting, scene composition, model and texture, variety of props and assets, creatively model, rudimentary or unfinished concept showing understanding of goals, create solid high fidelity textures, create shaders, right? So there's a bunch of information there. it kind of says to me that, okay, well, they've mentioned architecture. That probably means they might be thinking about buildings, right? We've got modeling and texturing props and assets. So they want to see that in your portfolio, like that you can see that you can make props and you can make assets, right? They want you to work from concept art. So again, that's something that you could definitely showcase in your portfolio. Textures and materials, right? So all of this stuff that is things that you need to showcase. And then this is getting into the kind of technical side of it. So what types of software should you know? 3ds Max, Maya, Photoshop, ZBrush, Substance, right? And generally for an environment artist, prop artist, whatever, you're going to need to know your basics, which are modeling, sculpting, texturing, game engines, right? So you've got modeling, texturing, right? Sculpting for ZBrush, texturing for Substance, right? And then we've got, and because this is Epic, it's probably going to be Unreal Engine as the game engine, right? And then we've got just solid communicator. So these are your kind of core skills that you would have. So you need to be someone that can communicate well. You need to understand PBR and material. So if you can showcase that in your portfolio as well. This has actually got some 2D related stuff as well. So this is actually a job where we're doing some 2D and 3D related stuff as well. So it's, environment artist, but with 2D concept art as well by the looks of it. But yeah, so this gives you all the information that you know. And then as far as seeing like an example of that, when you search for something, if you search for, say, junior environment artist, and this is always the advice that I will give, this was not really possible when I was learning. They didn't have this, like ArtStation wasn't really a thing. So it was very hard to come by this information. But if you search for junior environment artist and you click on artist on ArtStation, you'll see a bunch of junior environment artists, right? And so this gives you a good indication. One thing you have to be cautious of is that they might have junior environment artists, might not necessarily be accurate. Sometimes it isn't accurate. They might have been promoted, for example, and they can't change their listing. They might have been a junior environment artist for 4 years, right? You don't know. So there's some information you can't tell from this. But what you can see is the types of things that you would expect to see on a portfolio. So I use this one. This is completely at random because I think it's got a good mixture of lots of different stuff on it. So good environment artist portfolio. It has some materials. We've got some props and individual assets. We've got some environment scenes. Usually for an environment artist, the most important thing is having a finished scene, at least one finished scene to a good quality, good standard. That's going to showcase like good compositional skills, good lighting. If you can have props and materials that feed into that scene, that's also a good plus because you're showcasing I made everything in this scene and it's being used in this scene and you can kind of see that, right? So that's something that I think is a pretty powerful thing to do as an environment artist, is to be able to show here's a bunch of props from that scene and this is how it's actually feeding into the scene, right? So that's pretty useful stuff as well. So yeah, just take a look at all of this stuff. That's the advice that I would give basically to answer that question there that we have. Okay, I'm trying to get through some more of these. So we have best practices for a clean pipeline. Modeling sometimes stresses me out because one often gets to about 50% of the model only to discover some of your topology does not deform well when animated, or that you should have done XYZ about 5 hours ago and now you're stuck with half working models that need extensive rework. So I'm wondering, is there a checklist or a set of guidelines that you could provide that would help us avoid the most common issues that come back to bite a 3D artist later down the road? I understand iteration is a part of artistic process, so I'm referring more to the technical side of things, considering the entire pipeline. So I guess a lot of this is just practice, I would say. In general, like, you have to make mistakes to learn from the mistakes, right? So if you make something wrong and then you learn from that, I think that's kind of the key takeaway for that. I would say there are a bunch of things, like in Blender, for example, you can get an add-on that basically shows you like how clean your meshes are. So like a mesh cleanup type tools and things like that. But yeah, it's mostly experience, right? It's mostly just practice. I would say, yeah, just kind of try. At least when you're learning, you definitely want to be making those mistakes. And then later on, okay, well, I need to model this as like, for example, when I did the Beetle, I wanted to bend and deform some parts of it, right? So what I would do is I would set up a really simple basic model, like a block out, and just try and bend it and see what happens, right? That's a good way to test that, to make sure that, I'm not committing to something that ultimately is going to be broken when I get to the final version. So that's a good thing you can do, like just test it with a clear example that doesn't take you a long time to model, and then you're not committing to it, sort of going 50% down the road with the model and then having to change it, right? Cool. We kind of covered AI, so I'm not going to talk again about AI. Entry level position. Since I finished my 3D animation program in December, I've been wondering if there's truly any entry level positions in the industry. I mean, everyone has to start somewhere, so I guess there must be, but I'm having a really hard time finding those truly entry level opportunities that don't require at least a year of experience. Would love your input on this. Yeah, so I mean, it's tough. It is one of those things, right? There isn't that many junior roles because a studio taking on a junior they have to dedicate more time to that person because they're basically having to train them and teach them a little bit more than they would someone who's got experience, right? So it is, but then the thing is, when you start with a junior, what's good about a junior is they bring fresh ideas. They have like lots of stuff that, skills that other artists, might not have. There's a lot of pros to a junior. So sometimes it's worth the investment, but you do generally tend to find that there is less of the junior roles out there. So there's not a huge amount I can say about that really, other than you just have to keep trying, keep practicing, and keep improving and keep applying for every opportunity that you see. And I know that the other thing is like, it's about getting your foot in the door. So if you do have to take a role that isn't, say you wanted to work in AAA, like ideally, I was super lucky because the first job I got was a AAA project. But you might find, oh, well, I could just take this job in a slightly smaller studio, which would get me a year's experience. And then I can level up my skills, level up my portfolio, and then I can move into AAA later in my career. So that's something that, you should definitely consider. There are things that you can do. I mean, I had experience, not necessarily in games, but I did actually do architecture, for example, and I also worked on some freelance projects. So those were all things that are really helpful as far as like experience is concerned. So it doesn't have to necessarily be directly in games, right? Okay, so Q&A, a couple of portfolio industry questions. What are realistic minimum requirements of candidates needed to possess skills and software apart from solid portfolio? So we covered that. It's your modeling, it's your sculpting, it's your game engine, it's your texturing software, right? And the best way to find that stuff as well is if you're on, say, like a portfolio. So go over to here. You can see, like, if I find myself, when I look at like one of my projects, if I go, say, like to one of the environments or something, I was actually showcasing this in my Q&A before this session for my Substance class. It has a bunch of those programs listed, right? So Substance for texturing, ZBrush for sculpting, Photoshop, Blender, modeling, etc., Unreal Engine, whatever. So you can see that it has all those skill sets like listed as part of the application. So that's something that you can also definitely look for. What is the recommended combination of programs to master? I think I just answered that, so we're good. How specialized should a portfolio be? Is it okay to show diversity, or it's smarter to gear a portfolio more towards one or two skills when applying? So I think we kind of covered that as well. I personally would try to pick your discipline. So if it's like I want to be an environment artist, then an environment artist is someone who does materials, props, and environments mostly. So that's what you should be looking at for portfolio, whereas a prop artist is mostly going to be doing individual props or hero assets. And then you've got, say, like a material artist is just going to be working mostly on materials. So yeah, you get those kind of ideas, right? And you can look at the example portfolios for that as well. How to gain experience, I think I just covered that as well. What are some good worldwide events like fairs, conferences, and such, and intend to attend in order to network, pitch ideas, and learn more about the ins and outs of games industry? So you've got your E3 and GDC. Those are obviously like pretty known about events and conferences. And then I would just search for them, right? Like I think if you just do a search for game industry conferences, like you'll find like lists of that type of stuff that you can attend. That would be the advice I'd give. And then you can probably find it local to wherever you're located. Can you give examples how to showcase different types of portfolios? I'm interested in technical 3D artist portfolio. I mean, a tech artist portfolio, I would expect to see kind of like tools and things like that. So if you search like, just again, you can use ArtStation for this, but if you search for a technical artist, you'll see that straight away. We go over to artist, it will pull up like a bunch of technical artists, and then we can see the types of things that they have. So like as an example, I'm just picking this one completely at random. This one from Dennis, you can see he has a bunch of tools We've got some substance tools. We've got some other tools for different programs, right? So it's like, have a look at this type of stuff. That's what I'd expect for maybe a more of a technical type of person. So you're effectively making tools, shaders, that type of stuff as a technical artist, right? You're assisting other teams. The idea is that you do those kind of things, right? Like you're making tools and processes. You might be doing some coding. You might be doing various different things. So it's a lot more technical, obviously, than an art role. So that's something that you can definitely look at as examples, like portfolios, again, for that type of thing. Great. Let me go through here. We covered the specializing and generalizing a lot already, so I'm not going to go through that. Self-reflecting, with the industry growing at a rate that seems exponential, it's exciting to know that there is a place for each of us in it. With that many different opportunities available, what kind of questions should we be asking ourselves to help us reflect and begin figuring out what place in the industry that is? So I guess like the main question you should ask yourself is, where do you want to be in the industry? Like, are you an artist? Are you a technical person? Like, what's the place that you want to be? If it's like an art role, then whereabouts in the art discipline do you want to be? Do you want to be an environment artist? And I found the best way to learn that is to experience it. So I tried a bunch of those things, and then when I tried them, I found out very quickly if I liked them or not. So that's something that is the best way to kind of figure it out. Sub-D modeling, how often is sub-D used for making high poly mesh in games nowadays, or is it mostly mid-poly or using booleans with the only concern with good shading and not topology? I don't think it's like one or the other. We don't tend to be like, yeah, we're only going to use sub-D or we're only going to use mid-poly. It depends on the situation and what we're trying to achieve, right? So it's about the project, the type of project you're making. So I have been in parts of projects where we used a lot of mid-poly, right? Or we used more sub-D approaches. It just depends on what's applicable for the current given situation, really. Roadmap to get into the video games industry, more of an open question, really. How and what do you recommend it should be, a step-by-step to getting inside the industry? I think I've talked about this a lot, but my route was education. Then it was like building a portfolio. It was networking. And then it was like, actually, the way I got my job was posting my work online. Once I posted it on Polycount, that's how I got my first job role. I never actually applied for the job, but then I would say it would be like building your portfolio, then going through the application process is the way you would generally go. Block out further detailing multiple objects. I'm coming from a character sculpting background recently, got more work as someone doing more hard surfacing prop and objects in sculpting. Constructing my base mesh and other objects around the character, use multiple objects and subtools to create a full character. Is the theory the same with hard surface and background and other asset creation? Like if I'm making a building, should I use multiple different objects with windows, doors, etc., or should I just use one? Theory's the same. You can split stuff up. The only real reason to make a sort of one watertight mesh thing is like often there's not really much of a reason for it as far as like putting it into a game engine. I guess there's a visual choice there because if you just jam objects together, it doesn't always look particularly good. So that's something that you have to consider. And then it's also about, animation and rigging as well. Like if it's one object, it's a lot easier to animate and rig it. But it doesn't mean that you can't rig with multiple objects. You definitely can. It's just something to consider, right? Okay, let me jump back over. There's some new questions, so I want to try and get through those as well. So level or environment design. What is your advice on creating levels or environments based on multiple concept reference gathering? I feel like it's taught often through creating a one-to-one match, but that's not how most production levels are made. Yeah, so I think the difference is like if you're making something for your portfolio, you're probably going to take the approach of following a concept and trying to match the concept as closely as possible. And I think for portfolio, if you're an artist, that's absolutely fine. When you get into actually making a game in production, generally we have designers who design out the game to make the gameplay fun, and then the environment artist will make the art look nice. That's generally the process, right, in summary. So I would say that you don't really need to worry about that, like, because it's like another department's responsibility or job to do the game design. If you're an artist, for example, or if you're a designer, then it's your job to figure that out. But generally, you don't need to worry about this approach. So if you're building a portfolio, I would just work with concept reference or real life reference, and it doesn't really matter so much about it being a fun, playable game space so much. I mean, it's something that you can definitely do if you want to, if it interests you. But ultimately, for a portfolio, if you're an artist, you're not being judged necessarily on how good a game designer you are, right? You're being judged much more on the art. So that would be what I would say. Props being between games and movies. What are the differences in using props between games and movies? Is there a distinction in the workflow? For instance, what guidance would you offer someone still uncertain about designing characters and props? What are the main distinctions in each of them? Are they equally different, as in the case with designing realistic characters? And then Jonas has said movies usually use pre-rendered scenes, whereas games mostly use real time, so the poly count and texture budgets vary. That's a very good answer. It's pretty much what I was going to say, is that it's pre-rendered. So basically a movie you render shot by shot, whereas a game is real time, so everything has to run and be optimized for real time. So the budgets are generally lower for a game. Obviously, we've got stuff now like Unreal 5, so budgets are increasing a lot, and workflows are becoming closer and closer all the time between games and movies, I think, which is awesome because it means we can put more detail into the games. So you'll notice that. But generally, I would say, the process is going to be the same. You still have to model and texture, except the only difference really is you're just working for a shot rather than working for something real time. So there are some other considerations, right? Like your composition is a lot easier to do in a single shot than it is to do in an environment where you've got multiple angles and multiple different stuff. It's why linear games are easier in general to figure out than an open world game, because open world you can approach from any direction. So it's something to think about, really. Does 3D modeling help my game design skill? I think we answered this. Yeah, it does. So I wanted to do game design courses such as Full Sail, other college universities, but they're quite expensive. They're in America, and I don't know if they have international standards to work anywhere in the world. Yeah, I mean, if you take a course and you've done something, I think that's fine. But yeah, it's in terms of like 3D modeling, yes, it will help you up to a certain point. I think if you're getting to like, unwrapping and texturing, that's not as applicable, but I think it's, it's still useful. The skills are still useful, right? I'm hoping to get into the gaming industry one day. I'm currently working as a freelancer, as a prop artist, and here to upgrade my skills as per the current industry standards. I want to be an environment artist. Can you guide me on how I should move forward on being an environment artist? I think I've covered this in a lot of detail already, which is that you generally have the advice. My general advice is you have education options, right? So you can go to university or college, or you can take online courses like CGMA, or you can be self-taught, which is kind of the same thing. It's like watching tutorials and learning on your through your own thing. So you're not in like a educational environment. You're more just like picking what you want to learn, doing it from off your own back, basically. And then at some point, that if you're an environment artist, that ends in you need to build a portfolio and you need to build a CV. And so once you have those two things, then you go through the process of an application to a studio, or you get picked up by someone approaching you. Those are kind of like the options that you generally have. So that's like really in summary, but there's lots to learn. Obviously, as an environment artist, you need to individually learn, how to work in levels, how to make models, how to unwrap and texture, how to put models in game engines, how to texture, how to make scenes. So there's a lot of different things. One of the great things, and also the slightly scarier things about being an environment artist, is that it's like very, very diverse. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to learn. So it can be kind of overwhelming. And also, I think, which is one of the things you'll see with the class, is that it's not even that you can't just like dip your toe in other areas. Like you've seen in the class that I'm doing rigging and animation. It's not typically something an environment artist will generally need to do, but it's like another skill that I can use when it comes, it makes me like a better game developer because I understand the processes. If I need to talk to the animation team about something, I understand generally what their job is about, and it just helps me a lot as being a better developer. So that's something that is really awesome about the industry. It's like there's nobody saying to me I can't go and learn animation. If I want to learn animation, I can learn it. That's one of the really cool things about it, is it's open to you. Like you can look at absolutely everything, which makes it kind of hard to choose, right? Like that's the other downside to it. It's something I struggled with when I first started, was picking the discipline. And I picked environment art because it was where I felt most calm and relaxed when I was working. It was where I felt most at home and passionate about the art I was creating, and it was where I had the best strengths, right? Like that's why I liked being an environment artist, why I picked it, basically. Avoiding the tutorial trap. Do you have any advice on how not to fall into a tutorial trap and just start making your own thing instead of following a ton of tutorials? As a beginner, it often feels that you need to learn more before you actually do something yourself, but the cycle never ends. Jonas said something I've heard previously is a 2-to-1 rule. It means watching 2 tutorials, then making one project of your own using the knowledge you learned. Definitely fall into this. Do the assets on the tutorial with some differences if you don't feel sure doing your own model? The tutorial does do something different, and then you could try to do a radically different one. So yeah, I mean, these are all good bits of advice. My advice would be, one of my friends who I also went to university with, he had a really good thing that he used to say to me, which was that when he had a project set by the class, he would basically do the class 3 times, and every single time he would change it slightly, and by the time he'd done the third iteration of it, he was way faster than the first time he did it, and then also his quality was a lot higher. So that's like a good piece of advice. It's kind of similar to the 2-to-1 rule, but basically every time you do a different iteration of it, it shouldn't really be following the tutorial. It should be your own version. So like, let's say the assignment was like, you're going to make a vehicle, or like let's say you're going to make one of my university lecture assignments was to make a transit van, right? So let's say you're going to make a transit van. You start with the one that's exactly from the tutorial, you make it 1-for-1, and then after that you do a different version where you make a completely different model. Like, it doesn't have to be a van, maybe it's like a different vehicle, right? And it's going to be very, very different to the one that you did when you did the van. And so I do this actually when I teach my substance class. That's actually how I set my homework, is I follow along with the tutorial homework, and then advanced homework, which is make your own material. So like, let's say in the class I do a substance like brick material in the first couple of weeks of my substance class, but the advanced homework is make a different material. So it doesn't have to be brick, it can be something else. You take the learning that you have from the tutorial and apply it, right? Okay. And then here we said, hi Ben, appreciate your work and thanks for the class. Do you have any tips on getting accurate measurements on modeling real objects? I know about modeling using orthographic images and get quick sizes using those, but sometimes it's a struggle on modeling using reference images on a weird angle, or on some working on limited amounts of reference. I appreciate any tips you have on that. Yeah, this is a good question. I think, so I definitely would advise the orthographic images if you can get them. So just for people who don't know, so we could do like, orthographic car or something, right? If you're modeling a car, this is the type of thing that can be very helpful. So you see like the back view, the side view, the front view, and then you can model from that in your 3D software. The more kind of advanced you get as a modeler, the less you really need these kind of things, because you just get used to how modeling works and size and proportion. You can kind of tell from 3D. You don't always have to do this, but it can definitely be helpful. Sometimes I will use this depending on what I'm trying to do. So that's a pretty good way to do it. I would say, as far as like reference is concerned, something that I would give advice about is use eBay. Because if you need to make something, right, like let's say you needed to make a laptop, we could search for a laptop we want to make. And then what you'll find, what's good about eBay is that they take images of it from every single angle and close up. So you get like all the detail, you know what you're modeling. And so without you taking photos of an object, it's very difficult for you to get this type of reference. That can be something that can be hard. So that's what I tend to do when if I'm doing a prop, that can be very helpful. I generally will look at just general references like Flickr, Pinterest, Google Images, all that kind of stuff. So if I was searching for a laptop, I'll do the same kind of thing with our images and everything, right? With the image, let's just see. I don't know why it's not letting me do image search for some reason on Google. I don't know why. But if I was to look at images here for the laptops, I generally will do stuff like I'll search for specific image sizes, because that can also help. Like, for example, if you search for images above a certain memory size, it will give you large images. So that's something that can also be helpful when you're trying, like you can see here, this is 4,000 pixels by 2,000 pixels. So the bigger the image, the easier it is to tell the detail, right? So that's something else that can be pretty handy. That would be most of what I would say. I'm just checking if there's anything else to your question. Yeah, limited amounts of reference. I've never run with all those tips. I've never run into a problem where I haven't been able to find enough reference images, like with eBay, Flickr, and all the tips I've just given, basically. Retopo versus modeling. If you had to choose in your next detailed model ready for video games and animate, do you model the character in such a way that retopology does not have to be done, or do you make the entire character and do a complete retopology? I have the same doubt for a high quality pistol. I mean, it's kind of different workflows. I would say I personally try to, as much as physically possible, avoid retopology, because there's a lot of times, because effectively when you retopologize something, you're having to make the model twice, right? So it's taking you twice as long. And so usually, I mean, there are cases where you do really need to retopologize stuff because you've you've sculpted something and the topology isn't very nice. You need to turn it into a better topology. That kind of makes sense. But most of the time, if I was modeling a high quality pistol, I wouldn't expect there to be any retopology, really. I think you can do that. You can model that by hand without needing to retopologize it, basically. It's mostly, I would honestly say it's mostly for organic and sculpted stuff that I would lean more into retopology for, at least as an environment artist. Your mileage may vary depending on the type of position you have. But generally, in my experience as an environment artist, retopology mostly ends in like organic stuff that needs to be like, rocks and that kind of stuff, right? Communication inside studios. Most of the studios that post jobs require good communication skills for applicants. What would be the criteria that's considered as good communication skills to build on, especially as junior artist, and how would you improve communication skills if you're not so good at it? I mean, that's a really challenging thing. I mean, I don't know. It's never really, I guess the thing is, the communication skill part is something that you tend to establish in the interview process, right? And obviously everybody is different, right? Like you're going to get people who are way more kind of extroverted versus introverted, and you'll see a lot of that in the games industry in general, because we definitely see people who like to play video games can lean towards being introverted. It's just like one of those things that tends to happen. And so I would say like the communication skill side of things, it's something that's going to happen when you go into the interview process, because they're going to be judging like your communication skills by how you communicate when you're in an interview setup, right? And so if you're someone who's not that confident, I would try to make that kind of clear in the interview. I'd say, I'm really passionate about this. Like I love working in art. I'm really keen to get into the industry, but I am somebody who's a little bit more nervous. So I just want to make that clear from the start of the interview or something like that. And I think that's kind of okay. Like most people are going to respond pretty well to that if you're kind of, as much as you can, doing your best. I think it's hard, isn't it? Because everybody's different. So, to some people that's going to feel really easy, like going into an interview. I mean, it's not to say you're not going to get nervous or whatever, but an interview experience and being confident and outgoing is sometimes that's just easy for certain people, and sometimes it's difficult for others. So it's tough. I guess the other advice I would give is practice, right? Like if you want to go into an interview and you want to do your best in an interview, some advice I would give is like maybe record yourself, get friends or family to listen to your interview, get advice on it, that kind of stuff. That's what I do. Like if I have a really important interview coming up and I'm nervous about it, it's something that I will do is I will record myself doing the interview, and then I'll go, sort of listen back to it, see where I could improve, that kind of stuff. I think that's pretty helpful, hopefully. Cool. And then I think so I answered this was just, Jonas said, on top of what Ben already mentioned, there's also a good event to attend. They also have an online career camp, which I highly recommend. Awesome. All right. I haven't actually seen that. That's cool. That sounds great. So thank you for sending that through. Okay, we got a couple of other ones I'll just try and go through. But once these ones are done, I'm going to wrap up for today because we've been going for about an hour and a half now. So it said, recently graduated and my portfolio is basically a whole game process from concept to environment to characters, 3D game design. What type of job can I apply for? Should I separate different topics covered in my portfolio? I'm also a junior. When I read a job description, I can do basically all the tasks and have all the requirements, but I feel like my portfolio is too wide, so that's why I get rejected. Yeah, that's a good, a fair kind of assumption, I think, based on what you've said. I think if you're not like specializing too much, I guess it depends on the job you're applying for, right? But I would say you're probably going to, like I mentioned earlier, you're probably going to be finding more success in a slightly smaller team. because you have a lot of different skills. So that's probably where I would aim for more if that's the type of role that you want and you want to be able to use all those different skills. Maybe look at slightly smaller studios or smaller companies. That would be the advice I'd give. What defines your level of seniority for a job? How or who defines your level of seniority in the video games industry to apply for a job? I mean, knowing in detail if you can be considered senior or not, and if you are not, how to be so and present yourself appropriately. Is there any rules that define seniority? Can years of experience be offset by skill? How do I make sure I have sufficient knowledge or experience? Good questions. So for those who don't know, there's like a pretty simple structure to how seniority works in the games industry. Generally, I mean, this is from an art perspective, right? I'm not sure so much on other roles. I would say it's probably kind of similar though. We start off at a junior level, right? So when you first join the industry, you could be a junior or you could be... my job was actually a graduate artist, which is like I just graduated, right? So it was graduate artist. It can be 3D artist, it could be whatever, right? You start off at a junior, usually means you have little or not very much experience. And so you require a little bit more hand holding and you generally need people to help you a bit more. You might need support from other artists. You might need to ask more questions, that kind of stuff. As you get a little bit more experience, like 1 or 2 years in the industry, you'll find that you don't need to ask as many questions. And that usually means that you're more at a mid-level, right? Seniority means different things at different companies. So as you move from a mid-level artist to a senior, that can be dictated by different things. It could be like your senior level. It could be the types of job responsibilities and roles that you have within the industry. So like, you could be someone who owns a particular area of a game or specializes in a particular area, or you could just have a sort of 5 or 6 years of experience, and that's what dictates you being more senior. In my experience, it seems to have mostly been about like longevity in the industry that dictates about seniority, right? So the longer you are in the industry, the more likely you tend to be into more of a senior role. So it's about experience generally, and then your skill sets and abilities. And at that point as a senior, I wouldn't expect you to be asking that many questions or need as much hand holding generally. It's more likely that you know exactly what you're doing, and you're more proactive about doing it, right? And then as you start to get up further past that, we have other roles, like we have our lead artist, who is your manager of all of the artists. So you end up kind of either splitting at that point into being going down the management route, which leads into being a lead or a manager of the team, or you can go more into the specialized discipline, which is what I do, which is going into principal role, right? And for a principal, that can mean, again, it can mean very different things. But for me, it's much more about pipelines and workflows and things like that, defining like how we're going to make things and that type of stuff, and mentoring and teaching and all that kind of stuff, like other bits that come into the industry that are not necessarily I guess like part of your role as a senior or as a mid-level or whatever. And you might do those things as well, like you might be a senior who does mentoring and teaching and things like that. So as I said, it can depend on what your role is, what's required of your role a little bit more. And again, it's experience. The longer you have in the industry as well, generally will dictate that seniority. Hopefully that kind of answers that. Cool. And then, hi, Ben. I'm good with 3D modeling because I have some experience working with indie game developers. I'm not very confident with texturing. So can you give some tips to understand texturing as a beginner? Difficult to give tips on texturing because it's a very vast, like broad topic. I would say, I mean, obviously that's kind of why I have the class, right? Like it's to teach texturing a little bit more. We're going to go into that like a lot more in terms of like how to actually texture our models and things. Mostly it's like Substance Painter. So I would start looking at Substance Painter tutorials if you're looking at trying to improve your texturing skills as a beginner. And I think like ArtStation as well has free tutorials under ArtStation Learning. So you could take a look at some of the prop texturing tutorials under there. That would probably be the advice I would give. Cool. Okay. I think that kind of covers everything. Degree or no degree. Let's just answer this one last question and then we'll wrap up for today. So I'm a second-year game design student from Canada. My current degree doesn't really teach me the pipeline to get into the art side of the industry. From the people I've asked, most of them have various experiences coming from freelance to having competed in bachelor arts. So my question is, how important is a degree, or is it more having a good portfolio and referrals? Sorry for typos as it's 6 a.m. It's okay. So I would say, I mean, obviously I do have a degree and there are some benefits to having a degree. So for example, moving abroad is something that can be useful if you have a degree. Like it's easier to move across different countries if you have a degree, for example. So that's something that can be useful. I wouldn't say that you have to have a degree to get a job in the games industry, because most of the time, for every interview I've done, that nobody has really asked me about my degree. They've mostly asked me about my portfolio. So it's a lot more portfolio driven, I would say. So that would be the answer. I wouldn't say you have to have a degree. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have a degree, though. Like personally, I think it's useful, and I'm also really grateful I have a degree. It's just, it's not something that's necessary, right? You can definitely get into the industry without it. So yeah, so that's pretty much all the questions answered. Thank you guys for watching and joining in and everything, and bearing with me as I go through all of those questions. That's been a lot. That's probably the most questions I've ever had in a Q&A, obviously, with the amount of students in the class. So yeah, definitely a fun thing. I'm looking forward to the next Q&As and things. So yeah, as I said, the class will be continuing now. We have our week 2 content already available, so you can watch all the videos and everything. That's due at the end of next week, and then I'm going to pick some people at random to do some reviews. So I think we can still do questions next week. I will say that the likelihood is I'm probably going to spend a little bit more time reviewing some assignments and things next week to show how that stuff goes, as far as like getting personal one-on-one reviews when you're actually in the CGMA ecosystem. That's like the next thing I want to kind of showcase in the class. But yeah, definitely encourage you to keep using the Discord. There's a lot of stuff in here already, which is really awesome. Lots of channels you can interact with, stuff you can ask, questions, sections, and all that stuff. So if you have that kind of any questions that you want to ask, please use the Discord as a way to go there. I would usually suggest the class questions if I was teaching the class in a proper kind of classroom environment. But I think because there's so many people, it's very hard to interact with the class questions stuff at the moment. And Discord seems to be like pretty nice because it's organizing things into threads. It's a little bit easier for me to kind of go through the questions one by one. So I think I'm going to just advise doing that going forward. But yeah, looking forward to seeing what everybody's going to produce as part of the class. I'm really excited to be able to offer the class for free and see all the amazing stuff that you guys are going to work on. So looking forward to the journey, and I hope everyone has a great weekend, rest of the week, wherever you are, what you're doing, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the class. Looking forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks very much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. Cheers.